What's happening, guys? Nordic Warrior here, back with another movie review. Yeah, I know, it's been a long ass time since I did one of these. In fact, I can't even remember when the last time was. It might have been the George Foreman film, but whatever, I digress. Today I want to talk about the movie Nefarious, which came out earlier this year, and sadly didn't get released in theatres over here, and got pretty much no promotion whatsoever. It's a movie that I recently came across at random, and initially I wasn't going to bother reviewing it. But I have to be honest, guys. This movie fascinated me, and it fascinated me for several reasons. Let's talk about it. First of all, I knew nothing about the movie going in. I never saw any trailers or read any trivia or anything. I went into it completely blind, and it's honestly one of the few movies in recent years that, despite being incredibly minimalistic, had me hooked for every second of its runtime. So the movie is essentially a psychological thriller. Usually psychological thrillers of this kind don't interest me, since I usually find them to be a bit pretentious and a bit contrived. But what worked about this movie is it took some of the qualities that I'd often associate with the horror genre and somehow made them work here. Let me do my best to explain what I mean. You know, guys, I know this isn't a horror movie exactly, but one of the things that horror movies can often lay claim to, at least when compared to other movie genres, is that it's probably the only movie genre that consistently deals with the concept of sin, and the concept of guilt and self-reflection. In my opinion, as well as the opinion of many observant film critics, horror movies have a way of relating the audience to the protagonist by introducing some sort of internal threat, rather than just throwing them into a haunted house or putting them up against a monster. The most profound horror movies deal with the protagonist doing some self-reflecting, and in some ways subliminally punishing themselves or facing their own inner demons to either conquer their own fears and insecurities or atone for their own sins. The protagonist will often have a secret that eats away at them and forces them to self-reflect, and either embrace or reject the concept of repentance, and in many cases, the external threat presented in these movies is a manifestation of that internal threat. Horror seems to be the only genre that consistently uses this as a theme. And I think in some ways people relate to that, if only subconsciously. The concept of repentance and facing your own guilt, facing up to your past mistakes, and either overcoming or succumbing to it. And I think it invokes a particular emotional response from the viewer that they're sometimes not able to properly interpret. I don't know about you guys, but for me this makes movies consistently more memorable, and therefore more profound. Why am I talking about this? Because in my personal opinion, Nefarious is one of the few non-horror films that clearly has this same quality. So the movie begins with a man named Dr. Alan Fisher throwing himself out a window for unknown reasons. It's revealed early on that Dr. Fisher was a psychiatrist who, shortly before his death, was appointed to the Oklahoma court to assess the mental state of a convicted killer named Edward Wayne Brady, who had been on death row for a while. And before his execution, he needs to be fully analysed. If he's declared insane, he'll be spared the death penalty. If not, then his execution will go ahead as planned. It's assumed that the stress of the situation, as well as some psychological manipulation, were what ultimately led to Dr. Fisher's fate. As a result of this, a new psychiatrist named Dr. James Martin, who acts as the movie's main protagonist, gets assigned to Dr. Fisher's position. This is where the overall minimalistic approach to the movie becomes apparent. The vast majority of the film, I'd say about 60 to 70% of it, takes place in the prison, with the serial killer being interviewed by Dr. Martin. During the interview, the killer claims that he's in fact a demon named Nefarious, who has basically taken control of Edward and is using him to manipulate and corrupt humanity, driving people towards sin and turning them away from God. It's revealed pretty early on that Dr. Martin is a devout atheist who essentially ridicules the idea of demon possession or theology of any kind, and is instead under the opinion that Edward is simply insane and suffering from multiple personality disorder, also known as DID. Without spoiling too much of the plot, because there are a few twists and turns, this movie is incredible, and it blew me away with how much I enjoyed it. Even though it's clearly low budget and working with a very minimalist approach, the movie does the best it possibly can with it. Obviously, with much of the movie taking place in one room, the thing that can absolutely make or break it is of course the acting. And the acting in this movie, particularly from Sean Patrick Flannery, who plays Edward, is absolutely fantastic. One of the best and most versatile acting performances I've seen in years. The back and forth between him and Dr. Martin is intense the whole way through, and I love the way that Edward basically turns the interview around completely, and no matter what Dr. Martin says or does, he always seems to be in control, and psychologically dissects him, effectively beating him at his own game. And as the movie goes on, Dr. Martin, who initially comes across as a good guy, starts to do a bit of self-reflecting, and you start to learn that he's actually a bit of a selfish scumbag, and his atheism and lack of any consistent moral standard, you start to feel, is simply a mask to absolve himself of responsibility and to avoid the consequences of his actions. I'm not sure if it was intended to come across this way by the filmmakers, but I honestly got the feeling that thematically, Dr. Martin was essentially facing not only the potentially demon-possessed serial killer on death row, but his own personal demons and his own personal insecurities. I think the movie heavily implies this throughout, and even though it's kept somewhat ambiguous until the end whether or not the possession is real, it's still something that works thematically in my personal opinion. I almost don't want to say any more about it because I don't want to spoil the movie, but long story short, I would highly recommend it. I give Nefarious a solid 9 out of 10. A fantastic movie and perhaps the best movie of the year. Thanks for watching, guys. Stay tuned for more movie reviews. Hope you guys enjoyed this one, and let me know what you guys think about the movie's concept in general. Thanks for watching and God bless.